Before we leave the topic of Ice Age DuPage, we wanted to share with you one more story that we discovered while doing research on this topic.
We've already told you of the discovery of the Perry Mastodon that was discovered in northern Glen Ellen in 1963 and has been on display at Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois ever since.
But you might be surprised to learn that this was not the first mastodon to be discovered in or near Wheaton or Glen Ellen, nor was it the first to have a link with nearby Wheaton College.
In this video, we'll tell you the story of this other mastodon discovery and of its unfortunate and complete destruction. Horace Jayne's horses and cows were thirsty. It had been a dry autumn, and winter's blast had arrived early, with freezing temperatures taking hold by mid-October. The cisterns of local farmers were drying up, and Farmer Jayne had resorted to drawing water from his neighbors' wells in order to water his own livestock. When precipitation finally came, it arrived in a snowstorm, which dumped several inches of snow across northeastern Illinois during the week of Thanksgiving in mid-November.
Horace Jayne, a 46-year-old farmer originally from Pennsylvania, along with his wife Lucy Robinson and their several children, had farmed their 54 acres situated between the village of Wheaton and the settlement of Winfield in DuPage County, Illinois, since 1860 to the present year of 1869. Theirs was a modest farm where they raised cows, corn, and cabbages.
The recent snow notwithstanding, and not wanting to take chances with his livestock, the pragmatic Jayne decided to dig a shallow well for his livestock to serve as a reliable source of water through the winter. An enduring marshy section in a small valley in the middle of his meadow, one of the lowest points on his farm, seemed to him to be an ideal location. So on Sunday, November 21st, Horace Jayne set about digging a 5-foot square by 5-foot deep water hole in the peaty and boggy soil.
About 3 feet down, the soft peat turned into claggy clay, and soon after, another foot down, Jayne struck something hard. Digging the large object out of the ground, Jayne recognized it as a bone of a large animal, although he couldn't imagine what the bone was and for what type of animal. Digging further, he came upon another large bone, which he knew to be from a large animal's leg. But as there was a job to be done and he was cold and wet, Jayne put the bones to the side and completed the day's work, allowing the thaw and groundwater to seep into the newly created watering hole.
The next day, Monday, saw temperatures hovering around freezing. Jayne mentioned the find of the large bones to one of his neighbors, who immediately suggested to him that the bones could be from some ancient animal, and thereby of great value to people who collect such things. This piqued Jayne's curiosity, as well as his Yankee capitalism. As the weather had turned stormy again, bringing both rain and snow, any further investigations into the bones would have to wait. In the interim, he and his neighbors could sit around a hot stove after the day's chores and speculate on the serendipitous finds.
On Thursday, Jayne took advantage of clearing and warming weather and set out with several curious and eager neighbors, armed with spades and shovels, to the new watering hole in the meadow below his house. After bailing water to clear the hole, they set about expanding the cut, more than doubling it in size. In this expanded trench, they found 2 additional bones of what appeared to be the lower portion of the animal's leg, a continuance of Jayne's previously found foreleg bone, the radius and ulna, articulated and stuck together in the claggy clay. Nearby the leg bones, they also found 4 immense ribs, as well as 12 large vertebrae, from no animal that they had ever seen.
By Friday, the news had gotten out that something strange and mysterious had been found on Jayne's farm. The continued fair weather brought out crowds of people who came to stare at Jayne and several of his neighbors, while they labored in the sticky mud of the expanding crater, speculating and prognosticating on what lay beneath. The diggers had decided to both widen and deepen the excavation, and so spent much of the day digging through wet clay of varying colors, to a depth of 10 feet or more, all the time bailing water that continually seeped into the hole. This backbreaking work yielded few additional bones, however, except for a few smaller ones found near the original bone layer, about 5 feet down.
As the news of the bones had spread to Chicago, more than 20 miles to the east, the Saturday edition of the Chicago Tribune broke the first news of Jayne's finds to its metropolitan readership, declaring them to be of an ancient mastodon. Since the weather remained fair, even more onlookers and from further afield came to roam over Jayne's farm. Nor did the diggers disappoint the excited spectators. By early afternoon, they had unearthed one of the more spectacular sets of bones from the ancient beast, that being the huge assemblage of pelvic bones, the ilium, ischium, and pubis bones, known to them as the innominate, well articulated and in a fine state of preservation. Close by these pelvic bones, they also found a few caudal vertebrae from near the tailbone, followed in short order by another skeletal prize, one of the huge femur bones.
Dr. Alfred Hadley Hiatt, a respected physician from nearby Wheaton and a professor at the fledgling Wheaton College, was among the many spectators who found their way to Jayne's farm, just 2 miles west-northwest of Wheaton that Saturday. Hiatt, a native of Indiana, was a contemporary of Jayne's, having been born in the same year and having arrived in the Wheaton area at about the same time. Perhaps more than anyone there, Hiatt was most qualified to assess the bones found on Jayne's farm, and was allowed to examine them at great length. His detailed and invaluable description of the bones and the excavation survives in an article in the Chicago Tribune from Sunday, November 28, 1869. In this newspaper article, Hiatt carefully describes each bone that had been found the previous week on Jayne's site, as well as their approximate location relative to one another in the trench, placing the front of the skeleton to the northwest, with the tail section heading southeast. Based on the bone measurements, he also speculated, much too generously, on the size of the animal, putting it at 22 feet long by 15 feet tall. But Hiatt immediately recognized the antiquity and scientific importance of the bones, and lamented the nonchalance and disregard as to how they were being handled by Jayne and his neighbors.
If Horace Jayne did not understand the scientific value of the bones, he most certainly did see their monetary value. And the next day, Sunday, he set up something of a makeshift museum in his barn, where the public were invited to view the newly found bones, scrubbed clean with a shoe brush and roughly assembled atop the hay floor, for the low price of 25 cents a head, or half price for children, which was about $10 and $5 respectively in 2020 money. The local weather had again taken a turn, entering a rainy period, making further digging more than difficult, the enlarged crater again filling with water to a depth of 4 feet or more. And so Jayne the digger turned into both a sentry and showman amidst the bones in his barn.
With a significant portion of the skeleton already exhumed, Jayne declared to his museum patrons that he would not stop digging until he had found the animal's head, the skull and tusks, which he was certain were close by where they had been digging, especially as they now had a good idea of how the dead animal had lain in the ground. Many of the museum visitors also prognosticated on the animal's remains. One saw it as a creature driven overboard from Noah's Ark. Another looked at the pelvic bones and declared it was the largest moth he had ever seen. Still another declared it to be Job's behemoth. Thinking with his stomach, a local Irishman declared that the bones would make a fine broth for a soup.
During the rainy digging hiatus, the following Tuesday saw a visit to Jayne's farm by a representative of the Chicago Academy of Sciences. The prestigious academy, founded a dozen years earlier in 1857, had quickly grown to have amassed the fourth largest collection of scientific specimens in the United States, in spite of having been significantly set back by a catastrophic fire in 1866. Less than 2 years earlier, the Academy had moved into a new, well-appointed 4-story brick building on Wabash Avenue in Chicago, between Jackson and Van Buren, on the west side of the street, near where the DePaul Lewis Center stands today. The Chicago Academy of Sciences building was built at a furnished cost of $43,000, or close to $2 million in today's money, with state-of-the-art workrooms, collection storage, and museum hall, and designed to be fireproof, with all masonry and steel construction, as a valuable lesson learned from their 1866 experience. In 1869, it was the very first natural history museum in the United States to open its collections for free public viewing.
After an examination of the bones, the Academy's representative, most likely Samuel A. Briggs, thought the specimen to be the remains of a single individual of the species Mastodon americanus. And as the Academy was keen to add to their collections, having acquired a few other smaller mastodon specimens from Fort Wayne, Indiana, only a year earlier, he offered Farmer Jayne the sum of $250, which is about $10,000 in today's money, a tidy sum for what was essentially a windfall. Jayne had also previously been offered $100 by another party, but he was holding out, as some of his neighbors had convinced him that the bones would fetch a far higher price.
In the days that followed, Jayne moved the bone collection to the nearby village of Wheaton, renting a substantial hall above a general store on one of its main streets, perhaps the local Masonic Hall, as Horace Jayne was an active member of the Masons. Jayne likely reasoned that he could attract more museum patrons in the more central location of the newly minted DuPage County seat, with transportation to and from Chicago via the Chicago and Northwestern Railway. And so it proved. Large crowds, including most of the men, women, and children of Wheaton, as well as many from faraway Naperville, Elgin, and Aurora, and even Chicago, lined up to view and marvel at the strange, mysterious, and massive bones found on Jayne's farmstead, and at 25 cents per head. With the move to Wheaton, the Chicago Tribune dubbed the antediluvian beast the Wheaton Mastodon, a name which stuck and traveled across the countryside as the news of the discovery spread.
By Saturday, the 5th of December, the excavation pit on Jayne's farm was completely filled with water and frozen over. But Jayne was keen to press on with the dig. After all, new bones meant more repeat business at his newly improvised museum. In the early morning, a dozen men baled and manually pumped water from the hole, while Jayne traveled to nearby Turner Junction, today's West Chicago, to acquire a large-capacity iron pump. After several hours, they managed to empty the pit of water, and even managed to find a few more broken ribs and vertebrae amidst the muddy slurry lining the hole. Another day of wet digging was spent on Sunday, yielding few additional finds for the makeshift crew, with some neighbors suggesting that it was due to their violation of the Sabbath.
Monday brought warmer temperatures, climbing above freezing, and several men again set to work in the muddy pit. By now they were using lengths of iron rod to probe into the ground, looking for large, solid objects, such as the missing skull, especially near the northwest corner of the hole, where the skeletal layout suggested the animal's lost head might be found. In time, the probes hit on something large beneath the ground in the search area, and so the crew excitedly set to digging, extending the excavation pit to the northwest. After several minutes of feverish digging, however, they only managed to come down upon the stump of an ancient tree, adjacent to the animal's remains. Some wondered aloud whether the stump was in fact the skull, while the majority of those present dismissed it merely as a tree stump. In fact, much preserved ancient wood had been found amidst the bones all throughout the excavation, with some disagreement amongst the diggers as to whether the wood was spruce or maple. Dejected and disappointed by the unsuccessful hunt for the elusive skull, Jayne sent everyone home.
In the days that followed, Jayne vowed he would continue to dig until he found the missing head, although there was little activity to be seen at Jayne's muddy crater. Perhaps Jayne was by this time preoccupied with his museum in Wheaton, which was still raking in visitors and cash. On December 10th, the weather shifted again, with storms dumping an inch or more of rain on the area and filling up Jayne's excavation pit with water, no doubt dampening his enthusiasm for the project. The Chicago Tribune, which had heretofore featured several articles on the Wheaton Mastodon, sensing that the evolving story no longer had any legs, posted its final article in the December 9th edition, wishing Mr. Jayne well with his mastodon and hoping that he would someday find his lost head.
More than 20 miles to the east, at the monthly meeting of the Chicago Academy of Sciences on December 14th, member Samuel A. Briggs reported that he had visited the Jayne site and examined the bones, and believed them to be from an adult Mastodon americanus. He reported that there was nothing remarkable about the specimen in terms of size relative to other Mastodon specimens, but did indicate that it would make an excellent addition to the museum's collection, and told the audience that they were in negotiations with Mr. Jayne.
In the ensuing weeks and months, hard winter set in across northeastern Illinois, and there was no further news of Horace Jayne or his mastodon bones. However, we can be somewhat certain that his Wheaton Bone Museum was still open to the public, as retail stores from as far away as southwest Wisconsin, 120 miles away, were still referencing the Wheaton Mastodon in their advertising in the spring of 1870.
But as the spring season slipped into summer, it is likely that the crowds that once had lined up to see the mysterious bones of Horace Jayne in the second-story hall of his Wheaton Museum had dwindled. Anyone in the area wanting to see the bones had already done so, and without any new discoveries of bones, the market for Jayne's Mastodon Museum was drying up with the summer heat.
As it is likely that few new offers had been forthcoming for the purchase of the mastodon bones, it is likely that Jayne then turned his attention back to the Chicago Academy of Sciences offer of $250 from the previous year. He was perhaps further spurred on by the recent news of even larger mastodon bones being found in nearby Aurora, Illinois, which would potentially devalue his mastodon skeleton. Whether $250 was the sum that he eventually agreed to, we do not know. But by September of 1870, newspapers reported that the Chicago Academy of Sciences had successfully procured the Wheaton Mastodon for their museum, ending the Mastodon's run in downtown Wheaton.
At the October 1870 Chicago Academy of Sciences monthly meeting, they officially reported the purchase and acquisition of the Wheaton Mastodon, along with the right of further exploration for additional bones. Dr. Norman Bridge, one of the Academy's officers, as well as a recent graduate of medical school and a professor of anatomy, had apparently sealed the deal with Horace Jayne. A few of the Academy's members, Charles Adams and Isaac Ferris, had already been out to the Jayne site exploring and had found a few additional bones, perhaps in the spoil heaps, which were then placed in the Academy Museum. And Dr. William Stimson, an officer of the Chicago Academy, as well as the museum curator, also spent some days in Wheaton examining the Mastodon site, no doubt looking for the missing skull.
Stimson had plans for the Wheaton Mastodon, as it was larger than the two mastodon skeletons obtained previously from Fort Wayne, Indiana, although he was yet missing significant portions of the animal. Newspaper reports had indicated that Jayne and the Chicago Academy of Sciences had found almost 50% of the animal's skeleton, but the description suggests something less than that. Stimson nonetheless intended to mount the skeleton prominently in their new museum's main hall, where their most important finds were displayed. It's not clear when the specimen was eventually unveiled, but by April of 1871, a Chicago Tribune reporter sniffed that the Wheaton Mastodon now adorns, more or less of him, the Chicago Academy of Sciences, an apparent swipe at the skeleton's partially absent anatomy.
But the Wheaton Mastodon's ascent to scientific preeminence was not to last, and students of Chicago history will no doubt already have an idea of where this story is heading. Later in 1871, after an extended dry summer season, in the evening hours of October 8th, warm southwest winds whipped a small fire in the southwest part of the city into a large conflagration, consuming several city blocks west of the Chicago River. As the fire spread out of control during the late hours of October 8th, there was a strong hope that the Chicago River would impede its progress further north, protecting the city center. But strong winds hurled burning ash and embers across the river, and by the early morning hours of October 9th, the northeast side of the river was engulfed in flames, with little or nothing to stop its advance into the city, north and east.
Then sometime during the chaotic and fiery melee of October 9th, the blaze bore down upon the new Academy building, several city blocks east of the river. The vaunted fireproof structure of the new Chicago Academy of Sciences building and museum was no match for the intense heat of the conflagration, which melted the steel girders that supported the building and compromised the very fabric of the stone that made up the structure, causing the building to collapse in on itself, leaving the building's contents open to the ravages of the fire.
By October 10th, the Great Chicago Fire had burned itself out, with the aid of a closing rainfall, concluding one of the largest urban conflagrations in human history, ultimately destroying more than 3 square miles of Chicago, killing 300 people, incinerating 17,000 buildings, and leaving more than 100,000 people homeless.
Within a few weeks, after days of sifting through the remains of the Academy's burnt carcass, John Foster and William Stimson, the president and secretary of the Chicago Academy of Sciences, sent a letter to members and patrons, enumerating in detail the destruction and loss of all of the Academy's collections and specimens, including the Wheaton and Fort Wayne Mastodons displayed in the main hall, as well as their extensive library and voluminous records collection.
Stimson, the museum curator and secretary of the Academy, was left utterly devastated and heartbroken, as the fire had not only destroyed the collections and displays of the Academy, which he had spent years assembling, but had also ravaged his entire life's research as a naturalist. All of his personal collections and manuscripts had been destroyed, along with the Academy's, in what he thought to be one of the safest structures in Chicago. Within 8 months of the fire, William Stimson died of tuberculosis in June of 1872 and was buried in an unmarked grave in St. John's Episcopal Cemetery of Howard County, Maryland.
As to the other principal characters of this story, Dr. Alfred Hiatt of Wheaton successfully expanded his medical practice into Chicago and commuted to his city practice daily via the train, later becoming professor of surgery at the Bennett Medical College of Chicago, as well as teaching anatomy at Wheaton College near his home. Hiatt passed away at the age of 68 in 1901 and is buried at Wheaton Cemetery with his wife, Mary Ann Bowman, who had preceded him in death a few years earlier.
The practical Horace Jayne pocketed the profits from his proboscidean windfall and sold his farm in 1874 at the age of 51, moving to Wheaton and opening a hardware store, which he operated for at least 3 years before retiring at the early age of 54, and while staying active in the local Masonic lodge. Although lucky in bones, he was unlucky in love. Jayne's first wife of 29 years and 7 children, Lucy Robinson, passed away in 1876, shortly before his retirement. Within a few years, Jayne married Alzina Brown Corey in 1879, before divorcing in early 1888. Just 3 months later, he married Martha Harbin, a marriage which appeared to last until his death, which came in 1898, at the age of 75. And in spite of his vows to the contrary, Mr. Jayne never did find his head. In the end, Horace Jayne was buried beneath the clay of Wheaton Cemetery, alongside his first wife, Lucy.
More than 150 years later, is it still possible to trace the original location of the Wheaton Mastodon site with any degree of accuracy? Using early county plat maps and topographical survey maps, as well as descriptions from 1869 newspapers, We believe so, at least to within a few hundred feet. The 1874 DuPage County plat map shows the exact location of the Jayne farm, near the western edge of Milton Township, south of what later became Jewell Road. The map also indicates the approximate location of the primary buildings on Jayne's property, the house and the barn, situated a few hundred feet east of where Jewell Road bends southward. This information alone narrows the search for the Mastodon site significantly.
Further, although imprecise, we are given multiple clues from contemporary Chicago Tribune newspaper accounts. These accounts indicate that the site was in the lowest part of his meadow, in a small valley of marshy ground, in the rear of his house and barn, and within a stone's throw of his dwelling. Using topographical survey maps from 1908, which undoubtedly reveal the unchanged topography from 1869, we can quickly zero in on one location on Jayne's 54-acre farm that appears to meet all of the aforementioned criteria, being fairly close to and behind the house and barn, in a small valley, and in one of the lowest parts of his property.
Mapping this 1908 location onto present-day maps puts the Wheaton Mastodon site just to the west of the intersection of Stanley Street and Prairie Avenue, approximately 500 feet south of Jewell Road in unincorporated DuPage County. Many area residents are familiar with the significant grade difference from Jewell Road sloping down to lower ground to the south, a vestige of Jayne's small valley. Indeed, the southeasterly slope behind the church along Page Street near Jewell Road, which was built circa 1970, and about 100 feet south of the Jayne house and barn location, has long been known as Church Hill and has been used by area residents for sledding for many years. Little did sledders realize that this same slope carried them hurtling downwards towards a Mastodon gravesite from 10,000 or more years earlier. But it needs to be said that given the accuracy of the 1908 survey maps, as well as the imprecise descriptions, we would judge this site location to be no better than plus or minus 100 to 200 feet in both cardinal directions.
It has been more than 150 years since Horace Jayne struck spade to bone, releasing the ancient animal from its clay confinement, only to have it perish a second time within a few years. There are likely more mastodon remains still buried deep beneath the peat and clay of this area, amidst this sleepy suburban subdivision, nestled between Winfield and Wheaton, Illinois, unless all traces were unwittingly and unceremoniously removed during the building boom of the 1960s and 70s. That notwithstanding, more than half of the Wheaton Mastodon skeleton was never recovered during the 19th century excavations, including some of the more diagnostic fossils, such as the skull, tusk, and teeth. We would hope that someday this site might be re-examined by scientists with the cooperation of local land and homeowners, for what it might yet reveal. We have often said that history and prehistory can be found in one's own backyard, and in this case especially, we believe that we are not too far off the mark.